It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey joins us from Brussels. Christopher, I know you can't get enough of Brexit, but that big EU summit isn't for another 2 weeks.
No, I was with people talking about terrorism today. There's a moment of calm, which is a good time to talk about terrorism.
All right. Well, we'll be talking about the tensions around the globe in a moment with journalist and commentator Celestine Bolen. Nice to see you.
Hello. Thank you very much.
Alexis Poulain, co-founder of The Modern World, Le Monde Moderne, the digital news website. Hello. Welcome back. And welcome back to Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Where does one find World Politics Review?
WorldPoliticsReview.com.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Maybe we should cry for Argentina. What a week it should have been for the South American nation, rolling out the red carpet for the planet, crowning the victor of the continent's most prestigious footballing tournament. Instead, well, we got news that the Copa Libertadores soccer final between River Plate and Boca Juniors has now been moved to Madrid after the spectacle that unfolded in the streets of Buenos Aires between rioting fans. And, of course, the protests against holding the G20 Summit it was a decision that was taken, by the way, long before Argentina found itself teetering on the brink of another bankruptcy. Argentina jokes, by the way, making the rounds. Even the nation's most famous son couldn't help himself. Pope Francis, at his weekly audience, reacting to a little mute boy running up to the rostrum to play with the Swiss Guard.
Leave him. If he wants to play here, let him play. He's Argentinian. He's unruly.
Judah Grunstein.
Well, it's a particular brand of Argentinian humor because it's a country that also all countries mess up. Argentina has a talent for doing it when they're in the international spotlight, and also when there's this hope for that this time they won't. This time they'll actually follow through. They'll show a different image of their country to the world. And each time it just seems they trip at the last step before they reach the trophy. And people who know and love Argentina, starting with the Argentinians, it's become ingrained as a sense of humor, as we could see with the Pope.
Isn't that just being a little too self-deprecating?
No, I think when you look at the historical record, they've got a good claim to the self-deprecating humor championship.
Christopher Dickey, you agree?
I think Judah nailed it. I think that Argentina has a proud history and a very checkered history, and I think that's right. They do fall flat on their face frequently in front of world opinion, but it is a beautiful country and they're charming people.
Should they be hosting a G20 summit when they're in such dire financial straits?
Well, you know what? Honestly, I was surprised when I first saw that the G20 was going to be held in Buenos Aires. I was surprised, frankly, that Argentina's economy was as big as other members of the G20, particularly given its financial troubles, many financial troubles of the last several decades. But it's good to have it in Latin America, and I'm sure that people will enjoy themselves while they're there.
enjoy themselves indeed. First, it was it's I don't know if it's enjoying, but there's certainly plenty of suspense over who's meeting who. There's the family photos, and there's also the sideline meetings. Donald Trump was supposed to meet Vladimir Putin at the G20. Then it was called off. Now, according to the Kremlin, there was an impromptu meeting that was to happen. No, says Washington. It's all up in the air because of last Sunday's seizure of 3 Ukrainian vessels off of Crimea. There were shots fired, 6 injured, all 24 aboard, detained for 2 months. And a simple explanation from the Russian president.
It's clearly a provocation organized by the Ukrainian authorities, and I think by the president himself, ahead of the presidential election.
Celestine Bowen?
Yes, I mean, a provocation when, their tug runs in, the Russian military runs into the tug, and that's the provocation by the tug. I mean, at a certain point, this becomes really ridiculous. I think Putin is being reminded of that this week with the cancellation of this meeting, although, interestingly, the Kremlin has said that it's not because of Ukraine, it's because of domestic American politics. They're just, deflecting as best they can.
Could there be an element of truth to that, though? Could it be in part because of domestic U.S. politics? After all, it's been a brutal week in the Russia investigation for Trump and being seen in a photo op alongside Vladimir Putin.
I mean, I think, at the end of the day, there are diplomats who still have some influence, I think, over the U.S. president and who might be, see that this will have a larger message, and it's a message that other leaders are trying to share in. I mean, the biggest fact of the matter is that Russia is trying to claim that the Azov Sea is Russian waters, which it just is not, even under the interpretation that Crimea can claim Russian waters. So, from a legal point of view, from a political point of view, from a geostrategic point of view, they're not in a position where they can throw blame.
The European Council President saying, Alexis Poulin, that the EU is going to roll over sanctions. Who's been firmer in this crisis, Washington or the European Union since the start of the week?
Always Washington, I think. The European Union has very difficulties to be heard or to put sanction over Russia. And if you see the way it will be dealt with, you have, of course, EU member states like the Baltic state who are very nervous about the neighbor with the scenario of Ukraine maybe possible at some point. Also that the Baltic states are money laundering state for Russian oligarchs, so they are safe in a way. But here it puts the question of NATO and the European army and the defense. And if it's only about sanction to the Russian economy, it's difficult for us because most of the gas we have here is coming from Russia. So sanction to Russia is sanction to us in Europe.
I think you have to make the distinction when you talk about Washington, whether you're talking about Trump or his administration. The American government has been very firm in terms of Russia sanctions, and more easily so because there's not a huge pro-Russia demographic or constituency in America or in Washington, whereas in the southern European states, Italy, Greece, for instance, there's a certain element, even Germany, and in France as well. And it's also easier for Washington to be very tough on sanctions because the U.S. and Russia really have very little bilateral trade.
Exactly.
So the companies that are really suffering from the sanctions are here in Europe.
But Washington, I mean, the U.S. want to export the gas to Germany, for example. So it's, having more market.
Yeah, so it's a win-win.
I mean, I was just going to say, I think that also we have to question whether sanctions are achieving their goal. So, frankly, more sanctions doesn't necessarily mean anything significant for Russia. I think more significant is not meeting Trump. Actually, for the Russians who want to be at the world, center of the world stage, sort of being dissed like that speaks quite loudly.
They were dissed. However, Christopher Dickey, Donald Trump tweeting on Thursday that, quote, he looked forward to a meaningful summit again with Putin as soon as this situation is resolved. Exclamation point. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't really see how it can be resolved. I mean, it's clear. I think you have to look at the geography of the Sea of Azov. You've got Crimea on one side, and you've got Russia on the other side, and you've got this little tiny strait of Kerch between those two territories. Once you say that Crimea is Russian, then you've bottled up that strait. And if you build a bridge across it, which they did for about $4 billion in the last few years, ever since the annexation of Crimea, then you've got your territory literally overarching the Strait of Kerch. Once you've done that, you can strangle the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk, I can never pronounce it. Once you're doing that, you're basically killing eastern Ukraine. And that's what Putin wants to do. And that is what he is doing. And there are not going to be any measures taken against him that are going to prevent that from happening. So I think that he's doing what he does. Incremental eating up of territory that used to be the Russian or the Soviet Empire.
You heard Christopher Celestine saying how for the Russians not meeting with Trump is a problem. For Trump at this point in time, how does he see Vladimir Putin when you look at both the context you've just described and, of course, the domestic content with that Russia investigation?
Well, you know, it may be that there is no, I think it was Judah was saying there's no real Russian lobby in the United States, but it doesn't need a lobby if it's got the President of the United States, and it pretty much does have the President of the United States. That's why there's this weird disconnect between what the President says and does and then what the U.S. government does. But in fact, what the U.S. government does, giving some anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, keeping some sanctions in place, none of that hurts Putin if he, on balance, looks at the overall situation and says, yeah, I can afford to take some sanctions. I can afford to have these problems. I get to keep Crimea. I get to keep the Sea of Azov. I get to kill eastern Ukraine. And I get the President of the United States. Sounds like a good deal to me.
There's the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. There is also what we saw when the time came for the family photo at the start of the summit. Everybody was wondering who would stand next to Saudi Arabia's crown prince. He was relegated all the way over to the far right of that photo. Mohammed bin Salman blasted by human rights advocates over the war in Yemen and the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Now, before the summit began, it was said that there wouldn't be a meeting between Trump and MBS. And of course, and now we have Al Arabiya news channel in Saudi Arabia claiming there has been, away from the cameras, some kind of a meeting. MBS is looming large at this summit.
Yeah, apparently Macron is going to be meeting with him as well, has met with him. It's actually, I mean, usually it's funny because the G20 was usually the most boring summit around after the financial crisis, right? After the danger of global financial catastrophe kind of disappeared, people kind of slept through the G20 summit. And now this is like a soap opera or something where you have all these competing plot lines about who's meeting who and who's more toxic than who. One of the things that I was thinking in terms of Putin and the Ukraine conflict is why now? Why do this now right before the G20 summit when it could make him toxic there? And then I'm thinking, well, no matter how toxic Putin makes himself, MBS takes the toxicity prize.
And we saw the two of them shaking hands and high-fiving even.
Well, Putin has a lot more leeway because he doesn't have to pretend to be concerned about civil rights or human rights or not killing or arresting dissidents. So he has an advantage over the Western democracies when it comes to dealing with MBS there. But again, this is one of the realities of global politics right now. You have people who are unseemly, who are even criminals, but they lead states that are important to the global economy and that are part of this grouping. And it's a long procedure to kick them out and might even be counterproductive in some ways. So it's a dilemma about how you deal with that.
Alexis Poulain, Judah reminding us that the G20 was created because there was this financial crisis. We saw the world really coming together because it was a moment when something had to be done on a global scale. And now the spectacle is one of, we won't even mention Macron meeting with the Japanese prime minister and arguing over the Renault-Nissan alliance. It seems like it's all about tensions.
Well, I think it's the world that is coming into this age of tension everywhere, and both inside the states and geostrategically. And if you see all the world leaders around the table, it's a table that's filled with blood. It's all about wars. It's about empires coming back. It's about fight for trade, but also for land. If you look at it now, it's less about open trade and globalization like it used to be. And now it's more sort of UN bis, just talking about how do we avoid a war, how do we make sure that we get the interest preserved. And it's all about also the selfies you can get, the photo opportunity. Surely when Putin is high-fiving MBS, it's all about the picture to tell the world, hey, look, this guy is my friend, and we'll see what we'll do with Yemen.
Could Could I make
It's
just
not.
one quick
Sorry,
point?
I was just going to say. I mean, let's not forget the one in Australia right after Crimea. You know, when people were sort of very ostentatiously shunning Putin, which, by the way, you know, was something he clearly never forgot. And you know, and I mean, the theater, it can be useful for diplomacy. I mean, and that's why I stress this idea that, you know, not meeting with him can have meaning. And by the way, for all of these people, the audience they care most about is the one back home. So, you know, I think that, you know, for Putin, I mean, as much as you may not think of it, given his geostrategic kind of maneuverings, the fact of the matter is he's trying to whip up some patriotism back home. And when it doesn't succeed, and he's not the master of the universe as they like to make him out to be, you know, that's not a win.
There's a fascinating contrast, I think, between the immediate financial crisis G20 meetings and today. During the financial crisis, there was this urgency that created a solidarity, and everyone was on the same page that they needed to meet. And there was a lot of disagreement about policy in terms of how to actually respond. Now there's more of a consensus, with the exception really of Trump, in terms of reducing trade protectionism and addressing climate change, again, with the exception of Trump. But there's disagreement among all the parties, and there's less solidarity around the table. So you have this reversal, whereas before there was solidarity and policy disagreement, now there's policy consensus and no solidarity.
Well, it wasn't all acrimony, Christopher Dickey. There was the signing of this amended version of the North American Free Trade Agreement between the leaders of the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Is that a question, or am I listening to a
No, I'm asking you.
I thought Declan's report on that. I thought Declan's report. I'm sorry, there's a pause between you and me, but I thought Declan's report on that and the other deals that were taking place was quite good. You know, at the end of the day, it's good news that they're reaching some kind of understanding in North America, but you didn't need to throw out the deal to begin with. This is an effort by Trump, once again, to show that no deal was good unless he made it. And I think, you know, the theater of let me just say, going back a moment, I think the theater of the G20 this time is not all for domestic constituents. If you ask me, I think that whole high five thing between Putin and Mohammed bin Salman was essentially for Trump to see, for Putin to say, we're going to cut deals with Saudi Arabia, and Saudis say, we've got other markets than the United States. It's all a game that they're playing. Of course, they may have been comparing notes on how to murder journalists, since both of them have done that, but I can't guarantee that was what they were talking about.
All right, Judah talking about a consensus when it comes to a lot of issues like the environment. We'll see if that's true when it comes to Brazil's president-elect when we come back. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey joins us from north of the border in the Belgian capital, Brussels. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to journalist and commentator Celestine Bolen. Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the news website Le Monde Moderne, The Modern World. And Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Get ready for AMLO and Bolsonaro. We're on the eve of a radical change of direction for Latin America's two biggest powers. Let's start with Mexico, where Andrés Manuel López Obrador is set to be sworn in Saturday as president. AMLO, seen earlier there, casting a ballot in a citizens' consultation he held this week with his supporters. They rejected a new airport for Mexico City. AMLO, who's repeatedly insisted he wants, quote, a new kind of democracy, but he insists it won't be an authoritarian power grab.
The new project of our nation will seek to establish an authentic democracy. We won't bet on building a dictatorship in any way or form. The challenges will be profound, but will take place with a firm adherence to the legal established order.
Alexis Poulain, do you know where he's going with this?
I don't know. It's been consultating. As you said, there was this House of the Transition where all his team is meeting the Mexican NGOs and the association, trade unions, to see what can be done to work together, which I think is quite good to, before coming into power, consult, rather than saying, oh, I got my plan, and then you'll go in the street and protest. So we'll have to wait and see how it's going to be possible for him. The big question being, of course, the economy and the trade, and if, things go wrong, maybe the US will be a pain for him. But clearly, it's a strong signal for South America with this new president trying new things at the time when you said where Bolsonaro is coming in power in Brazil, which is completely the opposite.
So Mark is slightly spooked, especially by his idea to go back on building that new airport for Mexico City. A lot of money's already been raised for that.
Maybe there'll be a lot of question mark for this, and also maybe we'll talk about nationalization. We don't know, and that might be where the global markets, will just freeze and say, "Oh, wait, it's not all about money, So this guy is not our friend." You'll have to wait for this.
There was another problem with the referendum over the airport, which is that I think only 2% of Mexican voters participated, and so there was this. He talked about a commitment to democracy. Referendums are tricky, right? They are pure democracy in certain ways, but they often are end runs around other democratic processes. And in this case, it was decided by a very minute percentage of the Mexican electorate. So there was this fear that actually it's just a new way for him to impose a sort of centralized state vision on Mexico, even if he's shown himself to be moderating his positions from some of his past positions.
So, Christopher Dickey, the narrative on Latin America as a whole has been that it's swinging to the right. AMLO, that's not the case. He, for instance, has invited Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, to his inauguration.
No, I think López Obrador is much more in line with, maybe not with Maduro, but with the Chavistas and with that kind of populism that we saw also in Bolivia and some of the other countries in northern South America. He is a populist, but we're so used to saying right-wing populist that sometimes we miss the point. And I think one of the things that's going on with López Obrador is that he is coming into a system that is so infamously corrupt, where you had first a long-time establishment party, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institutional Revolutionary Party, think of that. And then you had the PAN and the other parties. Every time the president winds up being incredibly corrupt, the government is incredibly corrupt, the police are incredibly corrupt, the corruption is rife, and you have a massive drug war going on in Mexico with a huge casualty count. All of that's very difficult. If he can do anything to get a handle on that in a democratic context, it'll be a good thing.
At the other end of the spectrum, there's Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil's far-right president-elect. He'll be sworn in on New Year's Day. By the way, he got the visit this week of Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, who paid a courtesy call en route to the G20. And they're both populists, Celestine Bolton, the AMLO and Bolsonaro, but they're very different.
They're very different, although, I mean, I do think that corruption, if you were to look for the line that goes through it, and apparently I'm not an expert on Latin America, but I mean, it is not, there are many other countries that are, really turning on this issue. You could argue everybody is always against corruption and nobody really succeeds, but I think in Peru there are some really serious efforts to tackle it in a very institutional kind of way. This isn't to say that Bolsonaro is an anodyne version of this.
Corruption, one of the main reasons you're saying that both these leaders have
people
been
are
elected.
fed up, and I think that comes out in different ways. So we're seeing the right wing in Brazil, and we're seeing a more sort of populist left wing in Mexico, and elsewhere some movement on this issue as well.
All right, there's concern among this week environmentalists over Bolsonaro. There was a report issued by one of the big environmental groups this week about how in the past year, the equivalent of 1 million football fields have been chopped down in the Amazon forest. Bolsonaro, who's named a climate skeptic as his foreign minister, and announced that Brazil won't be hosting next year's UN Climate Summit, officially for money reasons. But it's an open secret that he's not a big fan of the Paris Agreement.
The only sector of our economy that is doing well today is the agro-business industry, but it's subdued by environmental concerns, which don't actually help to protect the environment in any way. This is a contradiction, but it's very true.
How does the rest of the world react to this, Eric Sipounel?
Well, you see, the problem with the world leaders is that they talk a lot about environment, but they do not a lot about this. So you can have great speeches, but he's frank, he's honest, he's saying, I don't care about the environment, I want the economy to thrive, and I want the money to go in my pocket, which is Trump exactly the same thing. We have an approach on environment which is about the same on human rights, is that, well, it's okay until business comes in, and it's not okay no more. So we pretend. We know that the UN reports are on the table. We had the COP21. All the countries signed, and only 10 countries actually started some transition measures out of the hundreds and something that signed the agreement. So it's all a joke. Having Bolsonaro saying that, it's easy then for Emmanuel Macron to pretend he's a Earth champion, because he'll say, oh, look, he's very bad. Look what he's saying, look what he's doing. But in terms of what we're doing altogether, well, we should really stop altogether and say to these world leaders, stop pretending, act.
The saddest part is that after the Paris Agreement, even the most generous analysis was, it's a great first step. It's possibly the lowest common denominator that we could have gotten out of this kind of forum, but a lot of really robust follow-up is going to be necessary if this is even a good first step towards something. And instead, what we've seen is backsliding, starting with the U.S., which is morally and symbolically required for any progress to be made. Because if the U.S. isn't making an effort, China can talk a big game, but quietly start building coal plants all across Asia, which is what it's been doing. Mm-hmm. And that gives cover also to people like Bolsonaro, who are less central to climate change policy. At the same time,
well, the trouble is
I mentioned on a previous discussion about Bolsonaro that Brazil has this global image dichotomy. There's the good Brazil and the bad Brazil. And the good Brazil was really a force for the global South, participating in climate change diplomacy, advocating for technology transfers and things like that. So when you have a country that had been playing a very constructive and active role suddenly about face like that, it does do quite a bit of damage.
The problem is that Brazil, I mean, the rainforest is the lung for the rest of the earth. It's not about a country, it's about all of us, all together. So there should be some measures saying this is not the property of Brazil, it's the property of the world. But we don't go in this direction at all.
All right, speaking of the environment, as Madrid implements its ban on high-polluting vehicles from the city center, over here in Paris, shopkeepers on the Champs-Élysées hunkering down for what could be a second Saturday in a row of rioting. Yellow vest protesters want the scrapping of a fuel tax hike that they say punishes the less well-off who live far from city centers. It's all haunting Emmanuel Macron, who's offered to cap eco-taxes in case the price of crude soars.
I hear the legitimate anger, the impatience, the suffering of some of our people who want a better life right now. I owe this to them. And this is why we will push on and maintain our policies to help them to achieve a better standard of living as soon as possible. And I think we can do this without giving in to demagoguery.
Are those the right words to be using, Christopher Dickey?
No, I don't think so. I think that speech, I think his remarks fell absolutely flat with a lot of the French public. It just sounds like blah, 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 langue de bois, as they say, wooden tongue, wooden language. And it doesn't really mean anything for people who are going to be paying a hell of a lot more for diesel fuel and basically for all the fuel they need to transport themselves in January. It's coming up very quickly. They're already paying more. They're going to be paying a lot more. So I think that people are angry, and they were hoping that he would offer some kind of concrete compensation, if not monetary, not directly monetary, in terms of better incentives for public transport, free public transport, something like that. But it's not happening. It's all falling on the back of people who own cars. And let's face it, outside of Paris, that's how everybody gets around. And so you've got this also a huge division between Macron's city, Paris, which is very conscious of the environment, and Anne Hidalgo, the mayor, is always talking about it, and the rest of France that has to live by different standards but pay the price. And I think that's what we're seeing a reaction to.
Yeah, we saw it on Tuesday when the French president announced measures, part of the country's 10-year energy transition policy. His speech. Yellow vests at a highway roadblock in the eastern region of Alsace shook their heads while listening.
We're very disappointed. We're waiting for him to say something to calm us down.
He says nothing about us. We asked to be able to eat until the end of the month. It's not complicated. We're not against ecology.
He wants to try to buy us for peanuts and then take our money. It won't work, and the movement will grow even more.
And it seems as though the popularity of this movement is growing up to 80%, according to one survey.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting here is that this is a kind of a new kind of movement, and it's sort of shaking a president who does not have a lot of intermediary levers in terms of public opinion. He doesn't even have an opposition, really. So, you know, I think it's as much the method as the message in this case that's got people a little bit shaken, because there aren't leaders.
Are you surprised that he's not getting through, that he doesn't get it or doesn't get through?
But I think the problem is that what they're talking about is not just the fuel tax. I mean, that's the biggest problem. They're talking about the whole thing. Yeah. They're feeling kind of put down, set aside, ignored. We've heard that before. Obviously, there's a Trump electorate out there that was saying the same thing, but we're talking about, feeling overtaxed. At the end of the day, I kept watching the French coverage of this to really dig down and find out what's going on with these taxes. At the end of the day, the diesel prices went up, I don't know, something like 30 cents over the last year and a half, and of that, 1/3, so 10 cents out of 30, is actually due to taxes. I mean, that's what I'm just saying. This is about people being kind of fed up with seeing their taxes go here, there, and everywhere, and nothing coming back.
How's it going to end, Alexis Poulain?
Oh, good question. I think it's just
usually in the past it's ended with the president backing down. That's how it usually ends.
Pretty much. But here it seems that people live in different realities, and you see people like Emmanuel Macron, Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister. They're talking to themselves, they're talking to their crews, but they don't try. I mean, they say they listen, but they don't answer to the question that's been asked. The Yellow Vest put on the table some measure they want to see, and it's pretty revolutionary. It's not those Gaulois réfractaires or the French that don't want change. They do want change. But the problem is that Emmanuel Macron and the others, they are protecting a system that is coming to an end because everybody is seeing that it's a lie, it's a fraud. All the taxes actually means less public services. The schools have been closing, they're going far, hospitals are closing, housing for the elderly is more and more expensive. So why are we working? Why are we creating value? Why are we paying taxes if the state is just withdrawing from every part of life? And I think that this movement is just the start of something very profound, right. Not only in France, but everywhere, saying, wait a minute, it's not about making the money for the 1%, it's about having a better life. And the deal that we had after the war, the Second World War, and the welfare state, and this moment where we had social security, we had unemployment benefits, everything is just stopping right now because of the liberal mind of these elites.
Also, in the regions where the movement has emerged and is the strongest, they're even harder hit because these are villages and towns that the post office is closed. There's no doctor. Exactly. The hospital is further and further away. So in a city, when the hospital closes, it's a problem. But when that hospital was the closest hospital for a village that has no bakery, has no supermarkets, and so these people are entirely dependent on the car to access the basic services that we take for granted, and so the taxes are a little bit of it, but again, there's a lot more. It's
about public services.
Yeah.
About public services. One story that's caught the whole world's eye. A 34-year-old Chinese doctor is yet to publish his findings and claims to have done most of the work on his own in the lab in Shenzhen. He Jiangku is his name. Claims to have altered the genes of twin baby girls to enable them to resist future HIV infections. Father HIV positive, mother HIV negative. He became the instant star of a summit on human genome editing in Hong Kong this week.
For this specific case, I feel proud, actually. I feel proudest because the Mark thought he lost the hope for the life.
You said that there's been no other implantations, but just to be clear, are there any current pregnancies with embryos that have been genome edited as part of your clinical trials?
There is another one, but you tend to monitor. It's what? There's another potential pregnancy.
Celestine Bowen, what was your reaction to this story?
It's very weird. I mean, I think, obviously the interesting part of it is that nobody has actually seen the testing that he's done. So I'm not quite clear on how he managed to get before a public forum and make this claim when we're supposed to have, academic standards that are applied. Secondly, the Chinese have stopped whatever he was doing. He's now stopped. And obviously, the whole point is these
They must have known he was doing it.
Well, exactly. There are little missing pieces of the story. But I mean, obviously, the biggest issue is that it's dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous if we don't know what we're doing. We start doing things before we think about the consequences of what they're doing.
Christopher Dickey?
Well, obviously, there are huge ethical problems, but I am doubtful that this is a real thing. This is the kind of thing that used to be on the cover. It would come out and it would be on the cover of Time magazine or Newsweek, and everybody would go, oh my God. And then a couple of weeks later, it would be, oh, well, it really wasn't. It was a fraud. It was a guy trying to promote himself or a group of people trying to promote themselves. And that, frankly, this smells like that for the reasons that Celestine was talking about.
At the same time, I agree. At the same time, it's only going to be a matter of time, and I don't know enough about the technology to know for sure, but I'm sure there are labs that are able to do this sort of thing outside of the kind of surveillance state in China where we might not even find out about it. So again, it's more of an eye opener and a wake up call in terms of the pace of technological advances and progress and the ways in which we're going to be confronted with these things, probably regardless of the ethical norms that are applied in the research.
We've already cloned sheep. I mean, we've already done the cloning. That's a done deal.
Yeah, cloning sheep, and Rael was the last.
I was going to say the Raelians.
So it's we're getting into science fiction, cyberpunk territories here, and you're never disappointed with mankind. I mean, as soon as we got the technology, even if it's wrong, we'll try it. And we'll see where it goes. So you can be sure that we'll get genetically modified humans.
The scary part is that in general, as soon as there's a technology, not only do we try it, but it gets weaponized.
And of course, we'll get super Chinese soldiers.
Not exactly a positive note on which to conclude, but we'll leave it there. Judah Grunstein. I want to thank you, Celestine Bowen, Alexis Poulain, Christopher Dickey in Brussels. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.